So there we go, the recording is activated. Welcome everyone to today's webinar titled Succession Planning, How to Build a Plan so that your work continues without you. This webinar is brought to you and hosted by ATE Central. ATE Central acts as an information hub for the National Science Foundation's ATE grantee community. So thank you, ATE Central. Now, it's my pleasure today to introduce you to today's presenters. Let me start with Rachael Bauer. Rachael is the principal investigator of ATE Central, and she's located at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Rachael, would you say hello to everyone, and please introduce your co-presenters?
Absolutely, Mike. Hi, everybody. We're thrilled to have you here with us. Nancy and I can hardly believe that we've been doing this series on sustainability for 5 years now. Nancy, do you want to say hi to everybody?
Hi, folks. Glad to be with you today.
I'm not hearing her at the moment, but oh, there she is. Yeah, 5 years.
Guys.
So this is our final webinar in a 5-year series. Yeah. We can now. Yep. Nancy has been with us the whole time, and she'll share a little bit more about her background. And also today, we are thrilled to have with us Kathy Alfano. Kathy, do you want to just say hello real quick so people recognize your voice?
Hi, welcome.
Kathy has been involved with the AT community for quite a long time. As you can see, she was the founder and co-PI of the CREATE Center, and she's going to be telling us a little bit more about her work. As Mike mentioned, there's a chat window. I'm going to say hi to everybody in the chat window so you can see. There we go. It just popped up. If you have questions, we'd love to get your questions here, and I will field those questions to our experts as we go along. We'll also have some polls because we've told you, we've introduced ourselves briefly. We'll tell you a little bit more about ourselves in a moment, but we love to know who's joining us in these webinars. So Mike's going to open a poll, and it's very easy to answer. So you can just go ahead and click whichever button works for you. Maybe you're affiliated with an AT grant already. You might be working on an ATE grant yourself. Looks like somebody is in that position. And if you click on Other, feel free to tell us who you are in the chat window. So sometimes we have someone who's an administrator or an evaluator with us on one of the webinars, and we'd love to know who else is with us when we're doing these presentations. But it looks like, oh yeah, a couple people have clicked on Other. That's great. More people are joining. Okay, so, oh, that's interesting, a nonprofit manager. So somebody who is not maybe directly involved with AT work. Okay, well, I think people have had a chance to fill that in. Someone else looks like they're typing in the chat window. This is a pretty normal array of answers, don't you think, Nancy? We usually get the bulk of people who are affiliated with AT, but then folks from other places too.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the things we talk about really, I think you'll see, are pretty broad. The things we talk about are really broadly applicable, so I'm hoping everyone, ATE or otherwise, will find this very, very useful.
Absolutely. We have someone who's an evaluator, someone who's retired. All right. So I just wanted to kind of remind everybody, most of you are involved with the ATE program, but for those of you who aren't, ATE stands for Advanced Technological Education. It's a National Science Foundation funding stream, and it's NSF's only real program that focuses on technician education and puts community college faculty in a leadership role in the program. Big focus on professional development, obviously program improvement and program development in STEM areas. Right now we have about 300 projects and centers that are currently funded all over the U.S. And it's a real community. It's a group of people who really work closely together, and there are a lot of cross-cutting support for the community members, including AT Central, which is my own project. AT Central acts as an information hub, an archive, and portal for the community. We have a collection of resources that we've brought together that have been developed by AT grantees. It's a great way to understand the AT community better and also adopt or adapt resources that have been created by the principal investigators and their staff at the various projects and centers. We have a variety of services and tools, and we really work hard to be responsive to community needs. And so when we did a survey of the community before we wrote this last big grant, one of the things that people said they really were struggling with was sustainability. So in response to that, we reached out to Nancy, who we knew through other work, and got her involved to come and help us do this series of workshops and webinars that we've done over the last 5 years. So I'm going to turn things over to Nancy, and she can tell you a little bit more about herself and the work that she's been doing. Nancy, we're not hearing you at the moment.
Thanks,
We've
Rachel.
lost you momentarily.
And I'll just point out that if anyone has trouble hearing me at some point, just wave a flag. Sometimes the audio
Rachel,
can be a little
I'm wondering
quirky.
about Nancy's.
But I'm thrilled to be here. As Rachel mentioned,
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Am I back? Okay.
It's on and off, Nancy. You are back. Go ahead.
Okay. Anyway, it's been a good long relationship.
Oh dear.
We've been able to develop programming that has been for the ATE community, and in a way that I hope has been very helpful. My background has been helping not-for-profits figure out ways to become self-sustaining, and a lot of those questions are applicable whether you are a small business, whether
Nancy,
you are an ATE.
Nancy, you're.
Rach, do you want to try muting maybe?
Folks, let's give us just a moment to adjust the internet connection with Nancy. Nancy, we're going to make a suggestion that you log out and log back in. It'll take you just a moment, and Rachel, maybe you'll fill in for a moment while Nancy does that.
I'd be happy to do that. I can talk a little bit about Nancy's work, and Nancy can relog in. So for those...
Is this any better now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me at all now, or you would like me to log out?
No, you sound very far away, Nancy. We'd
Well,
like you to log out.
Okay, I'll be right back.
Okay, sorry folks. Of course, on our final webinar, we're having technical difficulties. So Ithaca is part of a not-for-profit organization based in New York City that really focuses on helping the academic community use digital technologies specifically to preserve scholarly work. You may be familiar with JSTOR, which is a not-for-profit digital library of academic journals. You may have used them in your library or know about them. Portico is an archive also associated with JSTOR and part of Ithaca. And Ithaca SNR is the research arm. They do research and consulting and have done a lot of work around preservation and sustainability of digital objects. And so Nancy, originally we were working with Nancy through that, and then Nancy broke off to do her own work with her own organization called BlueSky to Blueprint, and they do a lot of consulting and research and training around specifically thinking about issues like sustainability for those of us who are in a position where we have good activities, good resources, and we want to think about how to sustain them over the long haul. So
Rach, I'm back.
This season specifically...
I don't know if you can hear me.
Oh, fabulous. You sound much better now. Go ahead. I was just getting into the sustainability health check.
I'm going to try to talk quickly and clearly. I'll try another thing if this doesn't work, but I'll cross my fingers. So the series we're doing this year has a little different flavor. You may have noticed if you've joined us in the past that we took a very forward-looking, super ambitious, we are going to take every project in every national center and see how far and fast we can run to make everything self-sustaining. And while Rachael and I still feel that there's a lot of work to do in that direction, we also recognize that sometimes there are much more near-term, very pragmatic decisions to make. So you'll see that this season has been a real health check, a chance to take a look at what you've done, what you've created with your project or center, and figure out what next steps might be, whether it is racing far ahead or whether it's something more immediate to address whatever situation you happen to be facing. So we called it the Sustainability Health Check. And you'll see that the 3 topics we dealt with all kind of spoke to this theme. So we did one that was about a real tie-in with assessment and how the good work you do with your assessment professionals really feeds into figuring out how to set priorities and what your sustainability plan can look like. We did another webinar last month where we talked about how the paths for the things you've created might be very different. There might be some aspects that you decide to run ahead with quickly, and others need something that looks a little bit more like a safe place or a preservation solution. And finally today, I'm really thrilled about the topic we'll be talking about with Kathy Alfano, because it's a really awkward and strange topic that not everyone always wants to bring up, but it's awfully important, and that's succession planning. So instead of urging everyone on the line to go out and do great things, we're actually, again, quite awkwardly saying, yikes, let's think about what it might look like if we weren't the ones running these projects. And so Kathy's going to be able to help us speak about that. But before I jump in, I always love it when our speakers can take a minute to introduce themselves and their work. I think you'll see that Kathy is uniquely positioned to inform us about what some of the key elements need to be when you think about succession planning. I'll just point out that, again, it takes someone who not only has the experience, but a certain generosity of spirit to talk about what it takes to go through a process like this. So in advance, thank you, Kathy, and I'll turn it over to you to offer a brief introduction of your work.
Great. Thank you, Nancy. Hi. Thank you for joining us. My name is Kathy Alfano. I was happy to be asked to speak on the topic of succession planning because it's something that I've needed to address both with the grants that I've directed, but also as a concern for many of the colleges that I've worked with across the country. First, I'll give you a brief overview of my background, and then I'll set the stage for the interactive discussion of succession planning that we're hoping to have with you in this webinar. Although I started out as a chemist in industry, I've had a long career in education, both as a faculty member and administrator. And I've also been lucky enough to have served as a program director at NSF and co-lead for the ATE program. No matter what title I had, except for when I was at NSF, I've been writing and directing grant projects for more than 30 years, too. I'd like to highlight a project of mine that morphed into a series of ATE projects and centers to give you an example of how succession planning can be important. When I was a dean at College of the Canyons in California in 1996, we had a disconnect between low enrollment in our electronics classes and enthusiastic employers who wanted to work with our engineering program. It turned out that they needed really engineering technology technicians. When soon after I met with our regional deans group, it turned out they were also experiencing low enrollment in electronics, and I suggested that we get faculty together with industry and work on new curricula. Well, as you might guess, they said, sure, if you can get the money for it, we'll do it. So I wrote the first CREATE grant as a State of California grant in 1996. And the project has been so successful that it evolved into a NSF planning grant, then an NSF project grant, an NSF ATE regional center grant, and now as an NSF ATE support center. During the 20 years that I directed CREATE and was the PI, more than 27,000 students completed at least one CREATE credit course, and over 3,000 students completed certificates or degrees. When I wanted to take an early retirement buyout from my college in 2016 and go into consulting, having a strong successor was important, as CREATE was a trusted resource with faculty. As it turned out, the best successor was in another state, in Wisconsin, and Dr. Ken Walls has turned out to be an excellent principal investigator. He'd been a participant in our faculty development and was someone many of the faculty looked to for his expertise and leadership. He had also directed previous smaller NSF grants, so he was ready for the next step. When I approached him, he asked me to stay on as a co-PI to mentor faculty, and it has worked out so well that our National Visiting Committee commented that it was the smoothest transition they've seen. But as I'll explain later, that smooth transition took over 2 years of planning and deciding what were the unique features about the center that needed to be preserved and searching for the right candidate to continue the legacy. Each situation for succession planning is unique. While we will give you examples of situations and possible solutions, we want to hear from you what your experience and issues are so that this webinar addresses your situation too. Nancy?
Right. Well, Nancy seems to be muted at the moment, but I'll go ahead. This is Rachel again, and I'll talk a little bit about the goals of our webinar today. As Nancy mentioned, the first thing we want to do is just introduce this sort of
Thanks, Kathy.
possibly
That was terrific. And I do encourage everyone listening in to continue typing into the chat window when you have.
Nancy, are you there? We can't hear you again. I'm so sorry, folks. Okay, we're just not hearing you.
I'm here, Rachel.
We can hear you now.
Okay, I can't begin to guess
And
what's
we cannot
happening.
hear you now.
Wish I knew.
We all
Okay,
keep going.
all right, I'm going to try
You seem fine
again.
now, Nancy. Go
So
ahead.
the goals of today's Who Knows Why. We'll be talking about the topic of succession. We want to think about specifically why this is related to sustainability, but I'm sure that will become evident. We're going to talk about what some concrete steps are that you can take, but then most interesting of all, we will have Kathy on hand throughout this webinar to offer us examples both of how you do this and why you should be doing it. And I think we will all gain a great deal from that. But let's take a moment to answer another poll question before I leap in. Rachel, you want to tee this up for us?
Absolutely.
So the poll question we've got is...
So again,
okay.
we're... Sorry about that. We seem to be having overlap somehow. I'm not sure exactly what's going on. We've got a lag, so there may be an internet lag, so we really apologize, folks. We're going to do the best we can here, just going through. Let us know how you're feeling about the whole issue of succession planning, and we'll talk more about what that is, but in thinking about if you had to turn your work over to somebody else or have someone else pick up an important role. Okay, so lots of folks are saying that it's really important in general, but they don't feel like it's for them in particular. A few people are saying that it's of urgent importance. Again, if you put other in, you're welcome to chat with us and let us know what you mean by, what your thinking is, what you mean by other at this point. We'd love to hear about that. Okay. All right, so most people are feeling like it's not the most critical thing for them in particular, but they feel like it's an important topic. But then a few people who are saying it's really urgent. So I'm not surprised by that at all.
So, can you hear me
Nancy,
now,
are you
guys?
with us? We can't hear you. Oh, there you are.
I am with you. I
Yes,
see
we
my little
can.
microphone lighting up. Okay, good. So let's move on. But, you know, I'm hoping everyone thinks it's important. These polls are, you know, no right and wrong answers, just a chance for us to get started thinking about this. So when we think about sustainability, and again, I always like to start with this as a framing device for folks who might be here for the first time. To set the stage, we like to think about sustainability as not a way to race out and make $1 million, and not necessarily even something that always has to do with revenue at all, but identifying a plan that is going to keep the project or center or whatever the initiative is running based on valuable inputs. The inputs can be financial, but they often are donated time, goodwill, support from your institution. They can come from lots of sources. And the reason they come is that the people that are giving them to you have found real value in what it is you're doing. So identifying that cycle of creating the value and then encouraging people who benefit from it to continue supporting you in some way is what we really think of as a sustainability plan. I'm seeing some interesting notes. And so in terms of when we're going to talk about succession planning, for right now, we really are going to zero in a bit on the question as it pertains to staffing. We've talked in other webinars, and I would encourage you to go back to ATE Central because we have those webinars archived. And in fact, archiving is one of the ways you can think about sustaining some of the outputs. But you'll see the earlier webinars do talk about this. But today we're going to zero in on people, because staffing is really by far the most costly element, I'm going to guess, of everyone's budget. And if you think about the key
Nancy, we've lost you again. I don't know. I can't hear Nancy. Can others hear her? Okay.
determinants in why a project works or doesn't,
Sorry,
I'm going to
folks.
guess
We
that that's going to
really
have a lot to do with who the leader is. A lot of things flow from that person, and a lot of knowledge and expertise is wrapped up in that person. And I'll even mention that it doesn't only need to be the leader. There are often really, really key people throughout your organization. So let's try again. Is the sound back?
Absolutely. Just keep going. It's okay.
Is the sound back? Can folks hear me now? How is this? Okay, good. I apologize, but on my side, my little green microphone consistently shows me that it's fine. So I don't have a way to see when there's a problem. Anyway, here we go. So last month, we talked a bit about taking inventory of the good work you've done. And we talked a little bit about what it means to take a look at what you've done and figure out how to support that. And that can take lots of tangible forms. That can have to do with the curriculum you create. It can have to do with something very tangible like a textbook. But there are lots of intangibles as well. So we want to make sure we didn't forget something really, really important, and that's all of those values that end up bundled into this idea of leadership. What are the values that your leadership and even your key staff have acquired over time for the benefit of your organization? So the way to think about it is that what are those values that live in your leadership? Let's start with relationships. One example are things that, you know, your PI, your CEO, whoever that is, has developed over time.
Sure.
These can be relationships with industry
I think relationships are a key component.
These can be relationships with the dean or the provost at your university or college. Often, these organizations are fairly small, So
But they
it ends
also
up
can
being
be
the
with
person
your
running the project
community,
who
your
has a
industry
lot of those
advisory board,
relationships.
your partners,
Kathy,
the faculty.
would you like to share some of your
If
experience
you're at a college, they can be within your
in
college
how this has
or
worked for
even
you?
within your district or state, with professional organizations, and very importantly with NSF and the greater ATE community if you're part of ATE. Who do your partners contact if they have a question? Who can just pick up the phone and get help for you? These relationships have been built over many years, and a lot of trust building has occurred. So how can you transition this to another person? For me, I made sure that likely candidates to take over had as much contact with these partners as possible. Part of it was to see how they do, and the other is to see if they could build relationships also. I want to add another thought on relationships because we'll be coming to some of these points later. But sometimes the leader isn't just you. Think about succession for some of your key partners. You know, your industry partner. For ATE, you need to have that relationship with industry. Your key administration supporter. If that person isn't a supporter anymore, will you still be able to go on as you do? And how can you build relationships with their successor? So we'll be talking about a lot of these components of leadership, but think of relationships and leadership and succession broadly if you can.
Kathy, this is Rachel too. I mean, I feel like, within AT Central and other projects that I've run, sometimes it's not the PI, it could be the project manager. I mean, I've definitely seen instances where a huge amount of sort of institutional knowledge, if you like, lives with the second in command. And if that second in command goes away, it can be very, very difficult. Sometimes the PI isn't even on the grant full time. They're doing a bunch of different things. They may be an administrator or teaching, and they have a project manager. I don't know if that's been your experience too, but sometimes those second and third command people are very difficult to replace, and people don't think about that sometimes.
Absolutely. The next bullet that comes up, I advance, Nancy, I hope that's okay, processes.
Yeah, that's great.
And when I think of processes for the centers I've had, the projects I've had, it's the project manager. It's the person who's the person who picks up the phone when someone calls the center. And a key communication hub. They have the email list. They know how to get things done when we have an event, and that is a really key person. If they can write that up in a document, it is so helpful. And what we'll talk about later, sometimes the change in succession happens abruptly. You didn't plan it, so it's very important to plan for this succession as a normal part of your process in your project or center, because it could happen when you haven't planned for it.
Right. Yeah, when you least expect it. Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. Documenting and always being sort of in the back of your mind, considering if this person left or that person left, would I have the resources to easily retrain the next person? And where is all this documented? I think that's so key. So reputation, another huge, she's back. We were just starting on reputation. Let's see if we're good here.
I've got my feet up on the table here, Rachel. You're doing a great job. Kidding. No, I'm kidding. And I apologize again, and thank you for people for sticking with us. This is an interesting way to end 5 years of painless webinars.
Fairly seamless webinars, but you sound much better now. I think you're good.
Okay.
Yep.
Very good. Well, and Rachel, I always love it when you jump in anyway, so if there are other things here to jump in with, please feel free.
Absolutely.
So speaking of reputation, one of the things that leaders of projects become indelibly linked to is really the reputation, and I dare say the brand of what they've created. And this is a great thing. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's very natural for it to happen. But I think, as with many things like the relationships and the actual processes of how you do things, it's something that you want to think about because the relationship, the reputation itself can attach to certain things like reliability, excellence, whatever it is, forward thinking. And those are values that you want to attach to the organization, not just to a person. So I guess that's the main message. Those are things that should be imbued in messaging and in the processes and in everything so that just because a person leaves, everything else you keep doing, keeps that message going strong. Now, often we know that a lot of these grant-funded projects are fairly small, I would say, not all of them, but they're often small enough so that the PI is pretty much the CEO, who is pretty much the chief of state, who is pretty much the head fundraiser. I'm going to guess that many people would agree with me. Those roles tend to fold together if your total staffing and leadership team is fairly small. And now what that means for sustainability is pretty obvious, really. You may have the person who is running the project or center also not just having the relationships with folks on campus, but even with key contractors, key clients, key partners who are actually directly providing sources of financial support. And so that's a function that you really can't have a lot of lag time in finding a new person if that person is going to leave. That's again, a really, really critical role, quite specific to sustainability. And then again, speaking to the head of state role, and again, maybe things that kind of harken back to this notion of leadership as reputation. Individuals, especially in this world, tend to be almost synonymous with their project or centers. So again, it's not just a person retiring. It can be seen as quite an earth-shattering change. So this is going to be, it's a major shift. People have to have time to think about it, be made aware of it, and it certainly should factor into a search process because whoever's running it is not just moving papers around. They're actually out there representing what the work is that's been developed sometimes over decades. So these last two things, I know Kathy has a lot to share about. When we talked about processes, that really taps into like this bigger category called institutional memory. So this is great if we are all a team that has been together for a decade or more, and we just remember because we were all there. People know why we're doing the things we're doing, and they probably have a lot of information about why we're not doing certain things, things we've tried and didn't work, and there are probably good reasons and important reasons to understand. This often gets into questions of politics, campus politics, and things like that. These are all good things to be aware of, even if we don't want them to hinder the choices we make, we should be aware of them. So figuring out how to capture that information and make sure, again, it lives on in some way so that people are aware, even if, again, they're not going to be shackled by it. They should know about it all. And finally, something really critical, which is the question of vision. So not only knowing what has happened in the past that's gotten you to this point, but who's really driving the forward strategy of where things are going. Again, most often, this is very likely going to be your PI, your lead on this project. And so whoever takes that role is going to have to take on that mantle. Kathy, did you want to jump in here and share some examples to highlight how critical this function is?
Okay, Nancy. I'd like to mention, going one back just real quick with institutional memory, one of the ways that we found that was helpful in preserving the legacy was also to celebrate our anniversaries, anniversaries of our relationship with key industry partners, anniversaries of just being in existence, because for CREATE, as I mentioned, we've been in existence for more than 20 years. And when we had these anniversaries, we tried to document some of the things that had come along as milestones. And so all of these things that you can document ahead of time are very helpful, I think, to the next person who's going to come along, because part of that reputation that Nancy was talking about is that you're standing on the foundation and history of that success of your project. And so if someone comes in and they don't have that foundation and that longevity to talk about, then they don't have as much credibility maybe with the relationships. It's also important to identify who are the long-term supporters. And so this leads us to vision, which was what Nancy was mentioning. For me, vision was one of the hardest things about who sees the whole picture. I'd have to say it was one of the hardest things as far as leading a large consortium like I have, that I had some incredible people who worked with me, different faculty, different administrators, different industry, but they all had their own interests, and they were very passionate about their interests. So I had a couple of things that had small tastes for succession planning that made me really think. So one of them was that I had an illness, and I had to be gone for 3 months. And so someone stepped up, and I said, sure, that sounds good. And when I came back, I saw that there was a lot done with what they were interested in, and there was not a lot done in what they weren't interested in. And then I had the opportunity to go to NSF a few years later. And so I actually, became an NSF employee, and one of my co-PIs stepped up, a very capable lady, and so she took over, and her interest was electrical engineering. And she did so many great innovative things in electrical engineering while I was at NSF. But when I came back, some of the other areas that we would normally do just weren't done. So it made me think, with succession planning, you need someone who has the vision of the holistic view of the project or center. And so that's difficult. So then you have to decide, sure, whoever takes over, they're going to do things differently. But if we're serving our community and we're serving our students or our faculty or whoever is our constituency, what's the most important thing for them to have? And take the ego out of it. So maybe they won't do things the same, but what do I want to preserve? And then look for someone who can do that. And later on, I see a number of you have done questions about, sure, then we have to do hiring, and how can I get that person? Because sometimes the hiring process is completely out of your control. So hopefully we'll talk about that in one of the next segments. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. So this is actually a pretty good place to take a pause. In the next couple sections, we're going to look at some practical ways to think about how to address this. First, can it happen to us, and then what do we do if it happens? But are there any questions we should take a break to answer here?
Yeah, there are a couple that have come in. People are very interested in and this has come up so many times in our previous webinars. I don't know if you want to say anything about it, but how do they take something that how do they think about something that was part of ATE and incorporate it into another existing program, or someone mentioned 501c3 issues also, I think. And Nancy, I know we've talked so much about this, the sort of nuts and bolts of sustaining something. And I know in a lot of your work you talk about the fact that, this is something that it can take many different paths. I can't remember if we've had anyone talk about 501c3s, have we? I mean, directly?
I think so. I mean, what I've seen, I think that the issue that comes up here is that if part of your financial plan, yeah, Deirdre Sullivan and Nate is a good example.
Yeah, that's a good example,
and I've seen other funded projects through NSF, not necessarily in the ATE program, where they're getting funding over in one piece of the work, but then they spin something totally separate out. Let's say they create a 501c3, they create a foundation, and that foundation can operate somewhat separately. It definitely has a relationship back to the project. It can in several ways, but it can also function to the side of it, which makes it possible to be set up as a business, as a not-for-profit business. And depending on what model you're looking at, that is a path that you can take. I think that the structure of that makes it legally feasible to accept funds without monkeying around with the grant funding. Because I do understand that if you're actually raising money during the scope of a grant, you're obliged to spend down the money you earn before the NSF will let you continue spending down the grant. So that separation can be awfully important if it's operating as an actual business. In terms of succession planning, that's interesting too, because you have the potential in a standalone business of really hiring someone to run a business, right? And think about it, that's a different logic altogether. You know, hiring an executive director to run something separate and keeping the grant going in the way it has. Anyway, maybe that will be in the next generation of webinars.
Mike, there you go. Michael Mason asked a question and said, is it more usual to replace people by bringing in outsiders or to look more closely at people that have been on the staff or within your program? And this is something, Kathy, I know your example with your succession was that it was somebody who wasn't directly at your school, but definitely was aligned with your program, right?
Kathy has a lot to share about this. Yeah, we're going to get to that in the next section. And that, in fact, it's an incredibly interesting point to discuss. We're going to give Kathy a lot of time on that in just a minute. So let's first kind of address the gorilla in the room, so to speak, and kind of like the way we think about our own mortality, drafting a will, things like that. We just often don't want to think about this. If you're the one running something, if you're working with people who have been there for a while, it might actually be hard to bring up. This might be something that we'd all wish would just solve itself. And the reality is, of course, you know what I'm going to say, that's not really true. We all have to actually address this question because you never know what's going to happen. You never know what's going to happen, and it can happen for good reasons and bad reasons, but there's all kinds of scenarios, and so just a quick walk through some of them. You know, sometimes there's a leader in place for a long time, and then for some reason they leave. I share this citation with you just because I started to feel like some of these grant-funded projects operate a little bit like family businesses. And it feels that way, right? You often have a matriarch, a patriarch who's been running it and is closely tied with it for many, many years. And that can lead to a certain complacency. And again, it's hard to think this is bad. If things are going well, we're happy to let people who are successful keep running them. There's nothing wrong with that. So that's the good version of it. The bad version is that sometimes without having that planning in place, things can start to go wrong. So, and one scenario again is that just that the long-time leader leaves. You know, for something happens and the person leaves. It can be something entirely unexpected. It can be a career change. It can be a retirement. But the planning isn't in place, and that causes a problem. The other scenario I actually think is kind of interesting because I hadn't thought about it a whole lot, but actually it's worth looking at as well, which is way more awkward, which is that you've got a long-time leader, but actually maybe sometimes staying that long can be the problem. So imagine what happens when you have someone who stays in a position for, 15 or 20 years. That complacency can actually be a hindrance. It may be getting in the way of developing new generations of talent and looking for new opportunities. And so there may be logics that tell us that we want to force succession planning because it forces the organization to think hard about what it needs to do for a next generation of growth. So just to sum up, I'm putting together the succession plan or just thinking about these issues. It's going to help you limit the risks. It can help you reduce the idea of losing talent if things get a little too calcified. You can start to encourage next generations. It can end up saving you the time and money that you have to struggle with if there's no plan in place and some of that institutional memory and that process knowledge gets lost and you have to rebuild things. And essentially, it's setting you up for growth. It's going to set you up for thinking about, as Kathy mentioned, make sure there's no gap in the sales function. Make sure there's no gap in having the vision and taking that forward. Let's make sure that the folks who are there are incentivized to keep going, and if they're not in-house, we find out who they are. And so the risks of not doing it, you can kind of infer from the reasons to doing it. But if we don't do this, there's all kinds of risks of lost knowledge, lost information, and a certain degree of chaos. And who wants that? At the very least, it can be disorienting, and at the worst, it can lead to even a struggle for power and to figure out who gets to run this thing and who's in charge of it. So having this all made really explicit is an awfully important element of ensuring sustainability. So let's take a pause to ask you, we agree this is important, but we're probably not all doing it. So what's your greatest challenge when it comes to succession planning?
All right, so Mike's going to open up another one of these polls. Here we go. So knowing where to start, having the right tools to do it, identifying talent to make the place to take the place of a current leader or staff person, and of course internal politics, campus politics, institutional politics, all kinds of things can create issues or other. And please, again, feel free to pop any other examples you'd like in that chat for us. Well, this is interesting. Don asked, does NSF-AT support having a successor PI prior to the departure of the incumbent? Well, I guess that could be a co-PI, Don. If you're thinking about having someone and you have enough time ahead, you could potentially bring, a co-PI is a good person. That's basically what Kathy did, I think. All right, so this is interesting. It looks like the highest is, wow, it's interesting that it's internal politics or reluctance.
Yeah, and I think this is one of those times where we force a single answer. I'm going to guess that people would probably have opted for multiple answers here. I think there's a kind of a web.
Yeah, multiple choice. Yeah. You're probably right. Yep, absolutely. Somebody else just said money in the chat, in the chat window.
Yeah. All right.
Money is a major challenge.
Well, hopefully we will fortify you with the courage and at least a handful of good ideas of places to get started. That I think we can offer. So what are some good practices to consider? Now, some of these, and Kathy is going to be able to offer some real wonderful examples of how this has worked for her in particular. And then she'll argue with me about other things where it seems like a good idea, but in practice may be hard to actually implement. But the first thing is about securing buy-in. I mean, this is not an easy process. There has to be some level of agreement for this process to go forward. So I'd argue that you have to have agreement among the team in the first place to undertake it. And then there's all other kinds of buy-in that are going to take place along the way, from the leadership team itself to the campus you may be working on. And if you're heading towards a more complicated relationship that might bring in an entirely another university or partner, there's going to be a lot of conversations about how this is all going to work so that it goes smoothly. So Kathy, did you want to share your personal experience here?
Nancy, it's Mike. Kathy has let me know that she's having a little bit of an audio connection at this point. So I don't see her right back on yet, so we might have to go forward and come back to her.
Yeah, let's move ahead and we can come back.
That's fine. And in fact, we have plenty of time at the end to kind of jump back in and enhance these responses. But it's awfully important to think about this. One suggestion, by the way, for getting buy-in is you don't want to scare anybody, but you can have a conversation about risk avoidance. what things should we be doing to avoid these future scenarios that would be problematic for us? And often when people think about it that way, undertaking succession planning takes on a more altruistic tone that might fly a little bit better than just doing it out of obligation. So an important step to take is to have a look at whose staff is in key positions. So when we talk about succession planning, this goes back to a question raised right at the top of the call. We are absolutely talking about the leader. But let's not forget all those people who have become invested with so much in critical knowledge for the success of your project. So you want to think about which of those roles are mission critical, which personnel have expertise that is going to be difficult to replace, or some institutional knowledge that is going to be really difficult to replace. I think this is a critical thing. This points to, I was sitting in a meeting with someone not long ago, and he was someone who was doing programming for a really important software project, and it became clear around the table that if something were to happen to him, it might be hard for other people to just jump in and figure it out and figure out where he was with that. And that was a light bulb went off. You know, that's not a situation you want to be in for any key functions in the work you're doing. So the trick is to undertake that review of staff, make sure it may not just be the lead PI or the executive director, but there may be a handful of roles. And this is a process that
You know, Kathy, or Nancy, I think the other thing that can be really helpful, I know we do it at Scout all the time, is that we try to make it clear to our younger staff that while we would love them to stay forever, most people don't do that anymore in this world we live in. And that the more we can understand about what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, the smoother our transitions will be, and that in a way, it takes the pressure off them if they do, and they often do come and say, hey, I'm ready to move on to something else, or I found another opportunity. Acknowledging that there may be transitions with staff mean that it's more comfortable for them, and it also means that you get better documentation. So I think it's not a comfortable conversation to have sometimes, but it can actually make things much smoother if you're willing as a boss to step forward and talk to your staff about this stuff.
That's interesting because, and Kathy's point, which I will channel Kathy here. She had a point to make about saying, wow, you're talking about all these great permanent staff. She's like, the truth is, who has permanent staff? All of our staff are faculty, that we have a little bit of this person's time, a little bit of that person's time. The idea that you have all these full-time staff that you're afraid to lose may not actually be the reality for many projects and centers. And even, Rachel, the case you mentioned, you may actually be more used to having more turnover or ways to think about more flexibility. So I think what you're saying, like a recommendation might be, just make that conversation a regular part of, it can be performance review time, where we just figure out what is it that you've learned, and can we make sure that the rest of the organization is comfortable with that and is knowledgeable about that, so nothing gets too tightly wound into one person. Kathy, if you're back.
Yeah, I agree too. And nope, it sounds like Kathy might be back.
If
we'll
you're
see.
back and would like to jump in, you let me know. So.
She's just checking her audio system. Let's go ahead for another moment.
So again, this, the point is that some of those positions may require a fairly detailed plan going forward, where we're talking about maybe undertaking a search, talking about partnerships, and again, Kathy will speak to this, and maybe some are more about capturing the institutional memory in certain roles. So,
can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
We can hear you, yes.
Wonderful. Geez, this was the day for technical problems. I'm sorry. So just
no worries.
Know where you want me to jump in. I'm sorry.
No, this is fine. So, Kathy, the one thing I would love for you to speak to, we've been talking about what some practical steps are for people to take. We talked about securing buy-in. We talked about making sure that we've identified which staff, which roles really need some further attention. We've talked a little bit about the need to develop, maybe it's not a full-on recruiting plan, but it may be the documentation that supports it. The last one we're going to talk about, and I think this will let you kind of jump back in, is this notion of investing in staff development and recruitment. And I know you've done a lot that fits under this umbrella. So the notion is we're not just going to wait until someone says, I'm signing off in a couple weeks. We're going to be kind of in a perpetual recruitment mode so that we're constantly looking at our partners. We're constantly looking at our internal staff, our external partners, other colleagues in the field, so that we start to get comfortable with who might be an emerging leader, who might be an emerging person that we would consider bringing in and recruiting for something like this when the time comes. So Kathy, can you speak to that? I know that was an awfully important part of your strategy.
Yes, Nancy, and you said it very well. You know, for all the years that I've done grants and handed them off eventually to other people, you know, it was a constant cycle of looking for someone who would step up to the plate. Giving people opportunities to show leadership, to take more responsibility is very important. And I'd like to address either here or a little later also about some of the issues some people have been bringing up, which is how can you do it when you don't have control completely about the hiring process? So Nancy, do you want me to address that now, or do you want me to address that later?
No, now would be great.
Okay, great. Okay, so as Nancy was talking about these points when we were looking at making the slides, she was saying that, you know, that that when you're getting buy-in, you have to get it from, she mentioned the board. For me, it was always, who's the key administrator? And I think what it comes down to, and I really advise all of you to think about it for yourself.
We seem to have lost Kathy. Nancy, are you still there?
I'm still here. And if you'd like,
Okay.
if she comes back on momentarily, we can continue with this frame of thought. But if not, the next section are a series of kind of open-ended questions. So happy to just continue, and she can jump back in when that works.
Yeah, I'd say go ahead and let's move along, and then we'll catch up with Kathy when she's back. I'll text her.
So, but again, just to underline, I think one of the really critical points Kathy has made in our conversations, this is not an activity to do when there's some, you know, panic or urgency, because you certainly don't want to make any kind of a snap or decision out of a super urgent need. You want to have been thinking about this. She had a wonderful way, or has a wonderful way of talking about this, which is just, you're not really testing people, but you're giving people opportunities throughout, your internal people and your partners, and you're just keeping an eye on who starts stepping up. And when you start to notice that folks have started to step up and show importance and show that they might have the appetite and the aptitude to take this on, that starts to give you a feeling for who some of the candidates might be to take on the mantle. This is a long, ongoing process. Are there any questions before we go into the last section of the presentation? Yeah, and I'm sympathetic with the commenter who's talking about the funding. I mean, yeah, I think that will always be the big question.
You know, there was one other question that I got under a private chat where someone asked me about, you know, is there a sort of template for making a sustainability plan, and do we feel like, do we have one of those, and can we share it? And I think my experience is we certainly have some resources on AT Central that Nancy shared with us, some worksheets. But what's difficult is, I think everybody is within ATE. I think sometimes people are dealing with similar things. In the larger world of sustainability, it's a lot of different things. Nancy, do you have anything that you feel like you've created that's a sort of template for creating your plan, literally?
You know, I don't think I I don't think I have an actual document that says if you just fill in the blanks, here's your plan. Although we could probably talk about what that might look like, but it has to address certain elements.
Yeah.
The key elements of it have to be not an aspirational, but a factual discussion of who the users, current and potential users are, in what ways they're going to engage, where your project sits among other things that look similar. So is it unique and offering some unique value in some way? And then there's a financial aspect, which again doesn't just say my hope is to reapply for a next round of funding in 5 years, but it talks about here's what we're getting from industry and here's why we're confident it's going to keep coming. Here's what we're getting from donative sources, philanthropy, and here's why we think that's going to keep coming or change. And here's what we're getting from generating revenue, and here's why we're confident that that's going to remain steady or grow or whatever. So it's actually, the key element of it is that it's a conversation, or it's an explanation of what the value is in the project and what those sources of support are, backed up by evidence. So it can be a narrative document.
Yeah, and there's some great worksheets that we have on ATE Central that Nancy's created that you're welcome to check out. And of course, always email me or Nancy. Our emails will come up at the end, and we're happy to talk with you one-on-one too.
So there are some other questions that I think could come up. These are things that folks on the call might have thoughts about, and Kathy could certainly speak to if we are fortunate in the timing. But here are just some other things to think about. So again, like maybe this is, again, maybe a little bit of a fake question. It's really just a prompt, right? What is the right time to start thinking about succession planning? And I mean, if you're on the call today, the answer is you're probably already thinking about it. So this is something that can take place at any time, and as with sustainability planning, it's probably a good idea to undertake it if you don't already have a plan in place. The point really isn't so much when is the right time, but when is the wrong time, and the wrong time is, you know, when you learn that your longtime leader or PI is about to leave. It might be a little late. You want to have these things developed in the same way you would talk about long-range planning. So early, so that it's part of the kind of DNA of your work. I think one of the interesting things to think about is, you know, I don't know, I would be curious to hear what other people think about this. We have Kathy on the line, right, who's been talking about her own stance. She recognized that this was an issue, and she led her organization in a process to identify good partners, and she secured that great partner. She reorganized even her role in the effort. I'm going to guess that you might be in an organization, people could end up in organizations where you realize it's going to be an important process to undertake, but you're not the boss. And to me, that's actually even more interesting. How do you kind of kickstart this if you feel like it's really important, but it's not really necessarily your job to be the one to do it? I'm wondering if anyone on the line has had that scenario take place. I'll take a glance at the chat window to see if we have anyone who'd like to share an example. Anyway, even if you haven't had it happen, if you're in that situation where you feel like, yeah, this would be a good idea, but it's going to be awkward if I say, gee, we should think about, you know, who my colleague's successor will be. I'd go back to a point made earlier today, which is have a conversation about risk avoidance. Have a conversation about, you know, feed these ideas into a conversation of what are the risks that could befall the organization. And this is likely going to come up, and it will be a natural place for it to come up. Similarly, a conversation that has to do with performance review, just an assessment and review of existing key staff. This could easily come up without really shining the spotlight too harshly on any one person. So, Kathy, if
it looks like we might have
you're
Kathy
back,
back.
I will give you the last word, and you could share thoughts with us about if people are thinking about taking this idea forward. What do you think some of the tricky things that may come up would be? What were the trickiest things for you, and how might you recommend people deal with them?
So again, I'm sorry. I don't know why I keep getting jammed up here, but hopefully you'll keep hearing me. And so you want to know the trickiest questions that are likely to come up and how best to handle them. I'm not sure how much of what I was saying, because I kept on talking. I didn't realize I wasn't on the last conversation. So I would say the trickiest things are that if the did you get the part about how it's very important that you don't make what you do look too easy?
Tell us a little bit more about that.
No, go ahead and share that, Kathy.
Okay. All right. Well, darn. Okay. So I think it's very valuable to make your administration, your advisory board, the people you work with, understand that this is doing any kind of ATE grant or whatever kind of major project that you're working on is a lot of keeping the balls in the air. It's about keeping the relationships, all these things that we're talking about. And if you make it look too easy, they may think that they could just move somebody maybe who's on campus somewhere else and their job is going away into your job, or they might think they could get someone who has a business degree and they could bring them in. And really, it takes such a good combination of skills of someone who understands the education system and understands the business and understands how to do what we do, serve students and build curricula and do faculty development. And so it's not an average sort of skills. And so if you make it look too easy, then they're not going to understand that. So that would be the first thing that I'd say is before you get to the tricky questions that could come up, which is, okay, we'll take over. We know we can find somebody. We'll just put it through the regular HR process. I'd say is build that legacy of this is a specialized type of job. This takes a person who really buys into what we do, and we have a lot of relationships that will help our college and our organization, and we don't want to lose those. And so I would say that's number one. Now, what else? Should we answer questions, or do you want me to give some other examples?
Yeah, I mean, if there, we have a couple minutes left, not too many, but if you had kind of a last big thought to leave people with in terms of what you hope they'll be thinking about going forward, I think that would be great.
Okay, well, I would say that if we're going to do examples of what might not work, you know, projects have a natural life, and you know, it's very important if you can bring on a co-PI who can take over responsibility. But I've seen so many times where the succession doesn't go how they plan, and so that's why we thought succession would be a very important topic. The reason that succession didn't go well came down to the point that I was making, where they didn't understand in the administration of the fiscal agent. And as you know, I've had multiple large projects and centers where there was the fiscal agent college and then other partners. And so, as I said, I found that the best person was at another college to continue it. So what I did is I let my grant end at my college, and then the topics that we wanted to bring and the legacy and also my project manager, we all moved over to be co-PIs working remotely out of Wisconsin to this new one. That was the only way we could move it and still have someone who was a full-timer faculty at Wisconsin be in charge. He had to write the grant and submit it, and then we could be co-PIs or staff on his grant. So sometimes it's very tricky if your organization wants to keep it themselves and there's not that person there, and you have to think what are the best ways of doing what you want to do. There's also a lot of ways that you want to get into building relationships so that you can maybe get additional funding. Someone mentioned foundations, and sometimes you can spin off and even be separate from your organization and be a 501c3 or a foundation. So there's other ways that you can not have that organizational rules that can be difficult. But most people have to work within the rules and have to work within their college. And if you don't have that leeway to do that, then you need to talk up what would be the benefits of having this person that you could train and could be ready, and always bring up you could have future grants, because often that's a big selling point for your administration, that if you have somebody who really has that continuing relationship, they're more likely to be able to do a credit-based grant like ATE wants, and not an economic development grant or something else that doesn't fit into the model to get this kind of funding anymore.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I see from the chat that there are folks who are listening in who are sympathetic to your point of view as well.
Right. So let's move on here. Go ahead,
yeah,
Nancy. Sorry.
I think we're just going to start to wind down this webinar, but hang on for a minute, because at the very end you're going to see a screen pop up, which is our own little survey, so that you can report on your experience in attending this. Definitely complain as loud as you want about the audio. I'd be the first one to complain about it. But hopefully you got enough of the content out of it that was helpful for you as well. I just want to thank Kathy especially for sharing her experience in this, and for giving some really, really pragmatic and provocative advice for how to go about kind of getting the wheels turning, how to make sure that your people understand how complex your work really is, and also in being very open-minded about how to consider restructuring so that the work can continue even if you're not the one running it. So again, Kathy, this has been wonderful, so thank you very much.
Yeah, and thanks for being such a champ about logging in and dealing with our crazy system today. We have no idea what this is about. We've been, as we said, this is 5 years. We've never had this happen. So for some reason today, the universe is angry that we're stopping doing sustainability webinars and is playing tricks on us or something. We're not sure what happened today. Thanks to everybody for joining us, and thanks as always to Mike for being such a great host. And thanks to Nancy for 5 years of doing this with us. Mike, why don't you go ahead and jump to the survey? We'd love it if people would fill this out. You should, you can see it's probably opening now, and it may open in a second window for you. So just go ahead and fill it out in that second window, or you may have to click over to another tab on your browser. There's our contact information coming up, but we're easy to find online, and as Mike and Janet told you, you will be getting a copy of the recording, such as it is, and the slides in an email in the next couple of days. Mike also put the link to the survey in the chat if you're having any trouble. I just wanted to thank everybody again, and please fill out the survey. It's very helpful information for us, and I think we're ready to end the formal part of the webinar.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Thanks, Mike.
Good day, everyone. Thank you, Rachel. I'll leave the system open for just another minute so people can complete their responses to the survey, and thank you, panelists, again. So this officially ends the webinar, and I'm now shutting down the recording. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.